The 2026 Formula One season had barely begun, and already something happened that could put the FIA under massive pressure. 7 minutes into the very first qualifying session in Australia, the reigning world champion, Max Verstappen, hit the brakes for turn 1. And in a split second, the brand new Ford-powered Red Bull RB22 completely lost control. The rear wheels locked. The car spun almost 180 degrees. And the champion of the world slammed into the barriers before even completing his first flying lap. But here is the detail that has engineers across the paddock seriously concerned. Verstappen immediately said on the radio that the rear axle locked the moment he touched the brake pedal. Not the front. The rear. And under the brand new 2026 regulations, that detail could point to something far bigger than a simple crash. Because the braking system is now deeply connected with the hybrid energy recovery system, a system heavily regulated by the FIA. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Did the new rules just contribute to the first major accident of the season? And if that is true, what happened to the RB22 in Australia might not just be a Red Bull problem. It could be a warning for the entire grid. But the most shocking part of Verstappen's accident is something almost nobody noticed during the broadcast. And once you see that moment clearly, the whole crash starts to look very different. But to understand why this accident has suddenly put the FIA under pressure, you need to look at what was already happening earlier in the weekend in Melbourne. Because Verstappen's crash did not appear completely out of nowhere. In fact, the first warning signs had already started during the practice sessions. The RB22 looked incredibly fast in a straight line. Several teams immediately noticed that the Red Bull had some of the strongest top speed numbers on the circuit. But at the same time, something about the car looked unstable. Especially when Verstappen approached heavy braking zones. And there was another moment during practice that many fans completely missed. During one of the faster sections of the Albert Park circuit, Verstappen briefly lost control, ran through the gravel, and damaged part of the floor of the RB22. The team had to bring the car back into the garage and carry out serious repairs before qualifying even began. Now this detail might sound small. But under the brand new 2026 regulations, the floor of the car plays a huge role in generating aerodynamic downforce. Air flows under the car, creating suction that keeps the vehicle stable at high speed. If that airflow changes even slightly, the balance of the car can shift dramatically. Especially when the driver hits the brakes from very high speed. Red Bull mechanics repaired the damage as quickly as possible. From the outside, the car looked perfectly ready for qualifying. But internally, the team still had limited data about how the RB22 would behave at the absolute limit on this circuit. And that uncertainty became even more complicated because Verstappen also lost valuable track time earlier in the weekend due to an electronic issue that left the car stuck at the end of the pit lane. Less laps. Less data. Less time to find the perfect setup for the first qualifying session of the season. So when Q1 finally began, Red Bull was still searching for the exact operating window of the car. Verstappen left the garage. The RB22 accelerated down the main straight. Everything looked completely normal. He started his first flying lap. And then, just seconds later, something happened that nobody inside the paddock expected. Because the way the car lost control looked very different from a normal braking mistake. And when engineers slowed down the replay of the crash, one detail immediately stood out. Verstappen had not even started turning into the corner yet. The steering wheel was still straight. The car was perfectly aligned with the track. Then he touched the brake pedal. And in that exact moment, the rear axle locked. Not gradually. Not progressively. Instantly. The back of the RB22 snapped sideways with almost no warning, rotating violently before the car even reached the corner entry. From that moment, Verstappen had almost no chance to recover. The Red Bull spun nearly 180 degrees. The tires slid across the asphalt. Then the car shot backwards into the gravel trap before finally hitting the barriers on the outside of turn 1, bringing out a red flag that stopped the qualifying session for several minutes. For several seconds, the entire paddock was silent. Because drivers at Verstappen's level almost never lose control like that under braking. Especially not when the car is still traveling in a straight line. And that is exactly why the radio message that followed became so important. Verstappen did not say he braked too late. He did not say the front tires locked. Instead, he said something very precise. The rear simply locked the moment he touched the brake. That single detail immediately changed how engineers started looking at the crash. Because modern Formula One cars no longer rely only on traditional brakes. They use something called a brake-by-wire system. This means the rear braking force is partly controlled electronically. And at the same time, when the driver presses the brake pedal, the hybrid power unit begins recovering electrical energy from the rear axle. That energy recovery slows the car while charging the battery. But if that system becomes too aggressive, or if the calibration between the mechanical brakes and the hybrid system is not perfectly balanced, the rear wheels can suddenly lock. Almost like pulling a handbrake at extremely high speed. Under the brand new 2026 regulations, that interaction between the hybrid system and braking has become even more powerful. More electrical energy is recovered during braking than in previous seasons. Which means the balance between mechanical braking and hybrid braking is more delicate than ever before. And that is why what happened to Verstappen may have wider implications. Because if the system behaves unpredictably when pushed to the limit, the problem may not belong to one team alone. It could become a challenge for several teams across the grid. And that possibility is exactly what has started a quiet conversation inside the paddock tonight. Because the crash itself lasted only a few seconds. But the question behind it could affect the entire 2026 season. And that question is simple. Was this just a rare mistake in a difficult braking zone? Or did the first qualifying session of the year just reveal a hidden weakness in the brand new Formula One regulations? But the implications of this crash may go even further than Red Bull. Because the moment engineers started analyzing the replay and the telemetry, the conversation quickly moved beyond one team and one driver. It moved toward the regulations themselves. The 2026 season introduced one of the biggest technical changes Formula One has seen in decades. The hybrid systems are now far more powerful. Electrical energy recovery during braking plays a much bigger role in slowing the car. And that means the balance between the mechanical brakes and the hybrid braking system has become extremely delicate. In previous generations of Formula One cars, braking was dominated by the hydraulic brake system. Drivers had a very predictable relationship between the brake pedal and the behavior of the car. But under the new regulations, when the driver presses the brake pedal, several systems activate at the same time. The traditional brake discs slow the car. The hybrid system begins harvesting electrical energy from the rear axle. And the brake-by-wire system distributes the braking force electronically between the front and rear. All of these systems must work together perfectly. Because if one of them reacts slightly too aggressively, the balance of the car can shift instantly. And that is exactly what some engineers believe may have happened to Verstappen in Melbourne. The moment he touched the brake pedal approaching turn 1, the rear axle locked suddenly, sending the RB22 into a violent spin before he even reached the corner entry. From that point forward, the crash was unavoidable. The car rotated almost 180 degrees and slid backwards across the gravel before hitting the barriers. But the key question now is not only why it happened. The key question is whether the interaction between these systems can create similar moments for other teams. Because every car on the grid is now working with the same regulatory framework. Every team must balance hybrid energy recovery with mechanical braking. Every team must calibrate the brake-by-wire system correctly. And if the margin between stability and instability has become too narrow under the new rules, the FIA could suddenly find itself facing serious questions. Not about safety alone, but about whether the systems introduced in the new era behave exactly as intended under extreme racing conditions. For now, the FIA has not announced any investigation. And Red Bull itself has been cautious in its public comments. The team simply said they will analyze the data carefully before confirming the exact cause of the accident. But inside the paddock, engineers are already studying the telemetry from Verstappen's crash in microscopic detail. Brake pressure, energy recovery levels, battery deployment maps, rear suspension loads. Every single parameter from the seconds before the spin. Because if the issue was simply a setup mistake or an aggressive brake map, Red Bull may be able to correct it before the race. But if the instability is connected to the way the hybrid system interacts with braking under the new regulations, the implications could be far bigger than one qualifying accident. And that is why tomorrow's race in Melbourne may reveal much more than just who wins the first Grand Prix of the season. It may reveal whether what happened to Verstappen was an isolated moment, or the first warning sign of a technical challenge that could affect the entire Formula One grid in this brand new era. But the real moment of truth will come when the race actually begins. Because qualifying accidents can sometimes be misleading. A driver pushes too hard. A setup is slightly wrong. A tire temperature is not perfect. But the race exposes something much deeper. And tomorrow in Melbourne, every engineer in the paddock will be watching the same thing. The braking zones. Especially turn 1. Because that is exactly where Verstappen lost control when the rear axle of the RB22 suddenly locked the moment he touched the brake pedal. If the problem was simply a one-time calibration error, then Red Bull will likely fix it overnight. The team has one of the most advanced engineering operations in Formula One. They will study the telemetry, adjust the brake balance maps, Reconfigure the hybrid energy recovery settings, and send the car back onto the grid with a more stable setup. But if the issue is deeper than that, if it is connected to how the hybrid system interacts with braking under the new regulations, then the race could reveal something much more worrying. Because during a race, drivers brake hundreds of times. Heavy braking zones, low-speed corners, defensive moves, late overtakes. And every single one of those moments pushes the car closer to the edge of stability. For Verstappen, the situation becomes even more complicated. Instead of starting near the front, he will begin the race near the back of the grid. That means traffic, dirty air, cars ahead braking earlier than expected, and a constant need to overtake. Every overtake requires confidence under braking.